and welcome to Mythmakers. Mythmakers is the podcast for fantasy fans and fantasy creatives, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. My name is Julia Golding. I'm an author, but I also run the activities of our centre. And today I'm delighted to be joined by a name that's probably well known to many of you. Samantha Shannon has joined us because she has just published, thanks to Bloomsbury, the 10th anniversary edition of The Bone Season. It's a fantastic hardback. If you like hardbacks, this is the one to put on your wish list. I always like reading a real book from time to time, and this was very enjoyable. So welcome, Samantha.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
So let's start right back at your beginnings as a reader, really, probably more than a writer. What were the fantasy authors that you were reading as your entry to the world of fantasy? Who were the authors that really lit the spark for you?
You know, I always struggle with this question because I have quite a poor long-term memory. So I'm sure that my entire childhood just lies in the mist of time somewhere. I do distinctly remember reading a lot of C.S. Lewis when I was a kid.
Yeah.
I remember going to like a family holiday to Tunisia, and I took like the entire set of the Chronicles of Narnia with me. And I just pretty much stayed inside the hotel reading them the whole time, which probably drove my parents insane because they'd clearly paid for us to have a nice holiday inside with C.S. Lewis. I did read Tolkien at quite a young age. I read The Hobbit. I read The Lord of the Rings a little bit later, but I loved The Hobbit when I was a kid. I read Enid Blyton, like The Magic Faraway Tree. When I was kind of more in my teens, I read Garth Nix, who has he has this incredible series called the Aborson Trilogy. And that was kind of what got me back into fantasy after I started thinking that there wasn't really a place for me in it. I felt like when I was young, I felt that it was quite a masculine genre and that I wasn't really seeing any women get to take the lead in many fantasy novels, just as the solo lead. And Garth Nix really changed that for me because when I first read Sabriel, you know, that she's the main character to the point that the whole story is her name. And I just loved how Garth Nix dealt with her being a woman in this world. Like, you know, people respect her for the skill that she has. You know, she's not treated any differently for being a woman. Because I think it can be quite a hostile genre to women in some areas, particularly when it comes to misogyny within the genre. So, yeah, Garth Nix really changed that for me a lot. So I credit him with bringing me into fantasy, you know, really big time when I was a teenager. And yeah, it's just kind of only got into more of a fixation from there. I think fantasy is the genre that I feel like I really belong in.
Yeah, I'm just thinking Lyriel as well, the later book in the series. It got the most wonderful library in it, but again, another different, strong female protagonist.
Yes,
that's really interesting. Perhaps we should. I'm tempted to go down the rabbit hole of asking you about the misogyny, but that would not get us to the Bone Season. So let's go straight there. It's the 10th anniversary, so my maths allows me to work out that it came out in 2014.
2013, so technically the 10th anniversary was last year.
Okay, right. More or less. So you have a number of chunky fantasy novels under your belt, as well as an extensive series in the Bone Season. I'll just also show another book many of our listeners will be familiar with, which is The Priory of the Orange Tree, which is a separate series, just so people don't get confused. So when you were coming back to the Bone Season for its 10th anniversary, were you having sort of visions of the younger you writing it? And what were you thinking about that book as you came to revise it and expand it for its anniversary edition?
It was a really interesting cathartic process going back to it. So this came about because Bloomsbury wanted to do a new cover for the 10th anniversary edition. And I wrote The Bone Season when I was very young. I really started it when I was 19. I published it when I was 21, just after I graduated from Oxford. And I think it's an incredibly ambitious, huge idea. And I think my ambition outstripped my writing ability at the time. I was also trying to do a degree at the same time as writing it. And also there was a lot of media interest in me during my first year after I signed my book deal because of my age. And all of this meant that I felt like I couldn't really give the edit on The Bone Season the focus that it fully deserved. And if it had just been a standalone novel, I wouldn't have really thought anything of it. I think that each book we write is a kind of time capsule that represents the writer we were at that time. And I think that's normally fine. But The Bone Season is a series that I'm still working on now. So bear in mind, I started it when I was 19 and I'm now 32. And my writing has changed a lot since then. And my opinions on things have changed a lot. And I still love The Bone Season so much. I still have 3 more books in the series to publish. And it was an unusual situation where I'm still writing a book over a series over a decade after I wrote the first book. And so I suggested to my publisher, how would you feel if I edited the first book? And it's unusual because generally when you publish a book, you are not allowed to ever edit it again. It just is what it is. It's out there. But Bloomsbury were actually quite amenable to the idea, I think, because they could see that I was so passionate about it and that I had been wanting to do it for such a long time. Because I feel that the first book in the Bone Season series, I just felt like it had so much more potential than my younger self had quite known how to tap into. Like there's a lot of really interesting character dynamics and situations. And whenever I was reading it back to myself, I kept thinking, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you dig into that relationship a bit more? Why didn't you, make this joke that's quite clearly there and you just haven't done it? And yeah, to my surprise, Bloomsbury let me do it. And then I just decided to apply that to the whole series because it was being rejacketed with these beautiful new covers by Ivan Belikov. Yeah, it was fascinating. Bloomsbury did not know specifically what I wanted to do with it, which meant that I was my only editor. Obviously, all of the books have already been professionally edited. So I was going through it with the perspective of specifically what I wanted to do. And it was like I was in conversation with my younger self. So sometimes I was cringing a little bit, just, when I saw a sentence that was a bit clunky and clearly needed another go. But generally it was just it was kind of lovely and cathartic. And I ended up being actually very proud of my younger self because considering how young I was, to have this huge world in my head, even back then, I don't think I could come up with a world like The Bone Season now. I think being 30 has just exhausted my brain too much. But yeah, it was really fun. I enjoyed it in the end.
I'm just sitting here shocked that you think 30 is kind of like, sorry, I'm quite a bit further on than you. So
no, I'm just a very tired 30-year-old.
You're still young to me. So does this mean, Samantha, that you went straight from doing a degree? Was that a degree in English, Bunny? Or
yeah, it's English language literature, yeah.
Yeah. So did you go straight into being a full-time writer without passing go, without stopping?
I did. Yeah, I did. I was very lucky that Bloomsbury, they invested in my career at a very early point. And I got signed up originally for the first 3 books in the Bone Season series. But because the Bone Season had so much media interest, it became a New York Times bestseller, straight off the bat, which meant that Bloomsbury very quickly bought the other 4 books in the series. So yeah, they were very supportive. So there wasn't, I had previously worked other sort of student type jobs, but yeah, I was very lucky that I was able to go straight into my dream job, which was lovely.
Yeah. So did you find having that media spotlight on you? Because I was reading some remarks back from then when, the classic thing in that decade, I don't think it happens so much now, was, the next J K Rowling, all this stuff. I would have found that quite hard in your situation, just trying to keep perspective on, because you're not like J K Rowling at all as a writer. It's, there's no, if you're a Harry Potter fan, you're not immediately going to say, I find everything I want in the Bone Season. It's a different atmosphere entirely. How did you, I suppose I'm asking, were you able to navigate that without falling out of love with the whole business of writing? Not the act of writing, but the publishing world? Because they do kind of love you for a bit and then leave you.
Yes. It's actually, I think, quite remarkable, again, how aware I was of danger of that label. Because I think it can be quite easy to get swept away with people telling you how brilliant you are and how you're this prodigy. And weirdly, I never believed it. I was always very nervous about it. And I would actively say to interviewers, I'm not J K Rowling. This isn't Harry Potter. And J K Rowling was essentially a once in a generation phenomenon in some regard. Like you can't really say to a debut writer, you're going to sell as many copies as Harry Potter, because it's not a realistic expectation of anyone. And I think that the comparison between me and J K Rowling was quite shallow on the surface. It was because we are both British women who were publishing with Bloomsbury. and both had fantasy books that would comprise 7 installments. And I really think that was it. I don't think it wasn't really deeper than that, but it ended up getting slightly out of control. And I just had this label of the next J K Rowling for well over a year. And the other thing I noticed that was quite dangerous was that I was constantly being praised for how young I was. And the thing about age is that it's finite. It goes quite quickly. They don't feel young for very long in publishing. I think it lasted until I was maybe 22 or 23, and then I stopped being called young. And I was very, very conscious of that. I was thinking, if they're pitching me as my unique selling point is that I'm young, I've got a maximum of maybe 3 years before that runs out. And I was keenly aware of that danger. And I don't think I fell out of love with the process of publishing. I mean, it was perhaps because I just hadn't done it before and I hadn't had time to be jaded by it. And, I wanted this so badly. It was the dream I've had since I was a little kid, was to be a writer. I used to literally wish on stars, please make me a writer. But my mental health suffered enormously just because of the amount of pressure. I mean, I was a very, very shy, introverted, stereotypical writer, hiding in her room, writing in her book when she probably should have been out clubbing at uni. And I was really, really overwhelmed by the amount of intense interest in me. And it really was quite extraordinary. I actually spoke to someone the other day who did part of her dissertation on the phenomenon around me before I was even published. And that's strange as well, because I knew that it wasn't about the book, this interest. It was about me specifically. Mm. And that was strange. And I have looked back on that year or two of my life, and especially from the perspective of being a young woman, I found it interesting, because I would look back on the way I was photographed, for example, by publications. And I would just think, would a man be photographed like that? I don't think so. Would a man be able to talk about their art and not about all this sort of their personal life? I don't know. I did find it quite a gendered experience in some ways. But yeah, it was troubling. I pretty much had a slight mental breakdown towards the end of my final year at university and had to leave for a couple of weeks before one of my exams. I'm glad that I've come through that, and I feel much better now that I have a readership who stuck with me throughout that. And I feel way better now that I've actually got books that people can read and people are talking about the books rather than me.
Yeah, and when my first books were published in 2006, I had a year or two of something not as big as that, but similar, where I was picked out on a list of 25 authors of the future it was. And I was the children's because I was writing with kids at the time. And I was there with Robert McFarlane and all sorts of other people with great big profiles for some newspaper splash. But I was also a bit older. I was in my early 30s, plus I was married, plus I had young kids, and I'd had a previous career. So all of these things, I think, helped steady me, because I had come to it after been in other careers with other colleagues and had other identities. I think you've done brilliantly well to survive that fresh out of uni, because I think it's like being an actor. That time when you're the name everyone wants to employ, it can kill people, can kill off their sort of desire for doing the thing that they're doing. But
yeah, very much
negotiated it really well. So let's go back to the book rather than the phenomenon around the book. I was listening to there's a great scholar of C.S. Lewis called Michael Ward, a lecture just the other day, and he was talking about how C.S. Lewis had the idea that he wrote about, which is that stories have like two main elements, like very basic elements. One is obviously the words, which are like the plot and that kind of thing, but also something he called the kappa, which is like the secret atmosphere in the book. It's like a mood. It's not even as developed as a theme. It's a sort of the world, as you go through Narnia into the frosty world, that's your atmosphere. When you were thinking about the Bone season, were you aware of having some mood or theme that you were wanting to explore when you were at 19? Or did you find it when you went back to look at it 10 years later and think, oh yeah, that's what I was thinking, even though I didn't know it at the time?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. I'm not really sure in terms of atmosphere. I mean, it was the Bone season was two very different ideas coming together, and one of them was magical and one of them was dark. And I suppose I wanted to capture both of those things. And it was really two of my favorite genres coming together. So one of them is the dystopia, which is where the dark and the gritty atmosphere comes in. And one of them was epic fantasy. And I've always loved the scope of epic fantasy. And what I find really fascinating about the two genres is they almost do opposite things in some ways. So dystopia, usually when you read a dystopian novel, it is quite restrictive. So it's contained to one small community. And often that's very much the point. If you think of something like Divergent, for example, it's all set within Chicago. Well, I mean, not the last book, but it's this very contained, controlled environment. And I was really interested in what happens when you bring the two genres together. So what if you had an epic dystopia where you see both inside and outside the dystopian world? And I think one of the inspirations behind that was Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. And there's a really curious bit in that where tourists come into this, horrendous misogynistic world that she's constructed. And they're looking into Offred's world as tourists from the outside. And I found that really interesting because I hadn't really seen that in dystopia before. So I did want to capture this kind of dark, stomach-churning feeling that dystopias kind of provoked in me. But also, I love the magic of fantasy as well, and I wanted to inject that into the genre. So, in a way, it's two very different atmospheres pulling against each other. And I think Oxford was a great place for that because there is a lot of magic in it. It has this reputation as being this incredible, beautiful place, but then for me, in my mental state, it was a much darker place. So, there's two atmospheres kind of vibrating against each other throughout the text.
Yeah, so I mean, I was thinking about the use of Oxford in it. I moved out of Oxford about 2 years ago, but I'd lived there for a very long time as an Oxfordian or a normal person in Oxford. After I finished my doctorate, I was then just there with the normal folk. And one of the interesting things I think about Oxford when it appears in novels is the story about Oxford that people choose to tell, because very often it's about this university. And obviously, because of your experience of Oxford at the stage was that. I was wondering if you felt that the Oxford University side of it was the seed of your idea or the soil in which it grew. That was the way I was thinking about it.
Yeah. So like I said, it really was two separate ideas coming together. But I suppose I could have chosen to set the bulk of it in London rather than Oxford. And London is where we go in the first sequel, The Mime Order. So essentially it was the fantasy aspect of it came from London and the more dystopian element came from Oxford. And partly that is because my mental health was not great the entire time I was at Oxford, even before I had my book deal. I did feel very much like an odd fit there. I felt like a bit of an outsider. I come from a state school, not a grammar school or anything, just like a normal state school. And I did feel very out of my depth. I knew people, for example, who had been able to learn Latin at school. I didn't have that opportunity. So I felt this slight fear and anxiety pretty much the whole time I was there because I was just so sure that I wasn't really good enough. I was suffering from terrible imposter syndrome.
Oh, completely. Yeah.
Yeah. And
that's a very familiar story you're telling here.
Yeah. And it didn't really help when I didn't do especially well in my first year exams, my prelims. And then you get sorted into either the scholars or the commoners. I went into the commoners, which I still think is kind of terrible when you think about it for too long. But yeah, so some of the dystopian elements did come from the Oxford exam system. So the tunics that the characters wear, for example, when they pass their tests, they're white, pink and red, which is after the carnations that students wear for exams. And yeah, just generally, I was walking around the city looking at these beautiful old colleges and just imagining them as residences for these kind of powerful creatures that had control over the lives of these young people that have been shepherded in there. And yeah, so I suppose Oxford just was the natural setting for the first book in the series where Paige discovers this darkness behind her world and the place, it's kind of a place. When I talked about Oxford in the essay I wrote for the Waterstone special edition, I mentioned that Oxford is a place that is associated with power and privilege that is not shared equally. And I suppose that is kind of one of the themes of this story is about power and who holds it. And how Paige kind of slowly claws power back throughout the narrative. So yeah, I think it was the natural seed in which to plant the story, despite the fact that the influence also came from London.
So the next question I was going to ask you about the sort of the light to the darkness probably does actually fit also with that description you're making of it being a book that came from two ideas of the epic fantasy and the dystopian. But were you consciously looking for times to provide the solace? I guess it's what I'm looking at, the solace and the humor and the because it's not an unrelentingly bleak read. You know, I don't want people to go and say, "Oh, I can't read that; it's too depressing." It's not that read. It's got lots of wonderful details and inventive moments. But where do you find the lightness in that world? Let's ask the question that way around.
Oh, so the main one is, to me, just the character of Paige. When she came into my head, I really wanted her to be someone that the reader wanted to have them leading them through this dark world. And Paige can be serious, she can, she has a lot of moments in the book where she's very heroic and steps up to the plate. But she is also quite a naturally funny character, and she can see the humor in her situation. And one thing I did in the anniversary edition is I added a moment where she and her friend Julian, who've just been taken to Oxford and imprisoned there, they have this moment where they kind of acknowledge their situation and then just burst out laughing, because it's kind of horrific, but it's also ridiculous and absurd. And I just wanted them to have that moment where they just laugh at the ridiculousness of the situation. So I think Paige is someone who has, a bit of a sense of humor. She does see the kind of dark comedy in most situations. Yeah. And for me, I knew that Paige was going to be the perspective that we saw the entire 7-book series with. And therefore, she couldn't be someone who was too serious, because otherwise the reader would just find it too overwhelming.
Yeah.
So Paige for me is sort of the person who keeps the reader afloat in that sense. But I also did, like I say, want to tap into some of the magic of fantasy as well. And Paige has this gift. She's a dream walker, which means that she can leave her own body and jump into other people and possess them. But there is a kind of wonder in that gift that she has. And she also loves her home in the criminal underworld, where there are all these kind of very flamboyant, kind of exuberant characters, the crime lords of London that she remembers. So I did want to show the reader why she loves being clairvoyant and the sense of community that she gets from being part of that world. So there's a scene, for example, when it comes to the magic of her gift, where she enters the dreamscape, which is kind of like the mind of a butterfly, and just sees how extraordinarily beautiful it is, because butterflies see in like very vivid color. And she just has this amazing moment where she knows what it's like to be a butterfly. So it's just those little moments of wonder that I try to inject into the story, I think help carry you through the darker parts, hopefully.
But that's not a precious moment, though, because she, in the sense of being too twee, because she gets catapulted out of being a butterfly. And
it doesn't last very long. It's always like little moments in the bone season. You get a little bit of happiness for about 5 minutes, and then I take it away again.
It's not so. I think it's quite funny. That a big person trying to be a butterfly. I mean, it's just
she's horrified. Yeah, she realizes that she doesn't even know how to breathe as a butterfly because they don't have lungs. But yeah, I remember when I was writing the 5th book in the series, which I've just finished pretty much. There is a moment where I take Paige and one of her sort of the other characters out of the horror for a few chapters and just give them this time to spend together. And I knew that it was a little bit odd in terms of the pace of the story, that I just take Paige out. And I thought my editor was going to say something about it. And then she just said, you know what, I think Paige just deserves a break. We kind of agreed. So yeah.
On holiday.
Yeah, it's like a little holiday. So I'm glad that we came to that agreement together.
I think for me, the other area I found the lightness, other than in Paige, was in the friendships and the courage. So Julian and Liz and Nick, these other characters who are in her world, you feel that she's loved. And very often in dystopian novels that it's so cruel that people aren't really able to love each other, which I suppose is 1984, it gets to that point, doesn't it? It was the most depressing part of it.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think you've kept alive the rewards of human bravery, love, and loyalty. So Yeah.
I'm glad. Yeah, it is very much about found family in that respect, because Paige's own family has really been taken away from her by Sion and by the circumstances that she survived. So it was important to me that she does have this kind of this kind of motley crew around her who act as her family, and that a sense of family that goes beyond being related to each other by blood. And yeah, I did really love writing characters like Liz, who is just a fundamentally very kind person, despite the fact that she has been so downtrodden. And so just, she has lost a lot of hope, but she has kept that fundamental sense of kindness about her. And yeah, I mean, if the characters aren't fighting for some kind of light or love, it would be difficult for me to write. So yeah, she's definitely fighting to protect the people that she loves and who love her back.
So here's a kind of more of a craft question, because one of the things that sets apart a fantasy writer from, say, a historical novelist is that you're reading a lot of world building rather than research into a particular, or historical moment. So looking back at however you do your work, the new edition has a very helpful glossary and explanation of your world at the back. It looks very organized. So you've got very neat notebooks with all this in. Is that true? Or is it all just an emergent world, which you've then made an index for?
Neither, actually. So it's not emergent. I do definitely plan the story, but in terms of world building, and it always horrifies people when I tell them this, it's pretty much all in my head. I have an extraordinarily detailed memory when it comes to my own worlds. The sacrifice I make is that I can't remember basic stuff about my everyday life. I will not remember to, get the boiler serviced, but I will remember random little details about my own world. So yeah, I just seem to have a very good memory for that kind of detail. In terms of plot, I do definitely plan that out. I very much admire my colleagues who can write stories just on the fly. And I think there can be upsides to that. I think that it means that you are reacting to, you're not trying to force the character to do something that doesn't fit with their personality I think you can kind of cause them to react to things in the moment, and you can develop their character based on that. For me, writing a 7-book series like The Bone Season, I don't think I could not planned it. I mean, certainly my plans have changed over time. Like originally, book 5 was supposed to have this whole sort of pregnancy storyline that it does not have anymore. So I have really drastically changed some parts of it, but I have always broadly known where it was going. For me, I compare it to, if you're just wandering around with a map, but you don't have a destination, then you're not really going to get anywhere. You can explore, but to me, I like to have the destination in mind. And then that little bit of flexibility to choose how you get to your destination. You could potentially take a few different routes, but I like to know who the character needs to be by the end of this novel so that I can get them there. And I am a very chronological writer as well. I can't skip ahead to write scenes because I need to live everything with Paige so I know how she's reacting and who she's becoming. But yeah, definitely planned in terms of the main events of the story, what I know I'm going to reveal in each book, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I can't imagine how else you'd keep hold of a 7-part series otherwise. It would be, I mean, there have been examples like The Wheel of Time, which took a while to get through to the conclusion. And of course, Game of Thrones, which is sort of, and also The Name of the Wind. They don't seem to, and I imagine those writers, certainly in the case of George R. R. Martin and Patrick Rothfuss, maybe are more emergent in their thinking. I don't know.
I know Martin has described himself as being a gardener rather than an architect, where he called Tolkien an architect, which I found interesting. And I guess I can't remember exactly how he described the gardener, but I think it was kind of pruning things as they come up, I suppose. But yeah, I think it is good to have some degree of planning. I would be interested to know how like Martin and Rothfuss approach planning particularly.
Tolkien was an architect as it came to his larger legendarium, the stuff that's in the Silmarillion. But when he was writing The Lord of the Rings, he was totally emergent.
Oh, really? I didn't
know where it was going. No, there's a new edition of his letters just come out, which are fantastic. And it coincided with the Second World War, where he was both a full-time professor doing night duty for Fire Watch and the rest of it, and writing Lord of the Rings. And there's several times where he's just saying, I'm going to put this aside. Not going to do this. And you're saying, no, don't. History is... Fortunately, he had his son, Christopher, and C.S. Lewis didn't allow him to stop. But he didn't know, he didn't have a plan. So another sort of crafty question is the choice of approach. So the Bone season, you've mentioned it's from Paige's point of view, and it's very much, but it's first person from her point of view. Whereas the Priory of the Orange Tree, which is definitely on the epic fantasy scale, that has a series of interconnected points of view in third person, but geographically spread with a sort of interweaving of stories coming together. Was that because you wanted to shake it up, give yourself a different sort of scope and chance to write a different sort of story? How did you come to... I think it's entirely natural that you'd want to change, but let you answer that, how you came to, do a shift in your own approach there.
Sure. Well, when I was younger, I always wrote in limited third-person perspectives. I don't recall ever not writing in that way. And so I was quite surprised when I came up with the basic premise of the Bone season, and I just suddenly heard this voice in my head just saying, I like to imagine there are more of us in the beginning, which is the first line in the Bone season. So I being the first word. And that was very interesting because I had never written in first person, and her voice came to me so strongly, just almost out of nowhere. And it felt right. It does come with its challenges. Both of them come with their challenges. Mm-hmm. So with first person, just from Paige's perspective, the main challenge is that you don't know what the other characters are thinking, what they're doing all the time. So all of these characters have to be built through Paige. Which means that those characters have to come into contact with Paige quite a lot. And it's interesting with the villain, for example, because Paige can't really be near the antagonist too much because the antagonist really wants to kill her. So I have to try to build this character from a distance that Paige can't often be that close to. But at the same time, I like the challenge of writing from Paige's perspective. I don't know, I enjoy the challenge of trying to build the other characters through her. Obviously, it's up to the reader to determine how successful I am at doing that. But it's something that I've really enjoyed working on the series. And like I say, I think it makes it feel a bit more grounded. It allows me to build a large world, perhaps without overwhelming the reader, because it has to all be filtered through Paige, who is not like a self-insert of the reader in a way that I think some protagonists are, where they're kept kind of deliberately they're not given too much character so the reader can put themselves in their place. That's not the kind of character Paige is intended to be. But I think because she is just one solo first-person protagonist, she does hopefully assist the reader in walking through the world, because she is essentially a kind of avatar that they can see through. With Priory of the Orange Tree, again, it brings advantages and challenges. Having 4 or 5 perspective characters allows me to explore a lot more of the world, to build a much bigger world. I can, have multiple countries being shown at the same time, show the same event and what effect it's having in multiple places. Again, I suppose it's challenging just because you have to distinguish all the voices from each other. I really want the reader to open the page and know straight away whose head they're in. Yeah. That is easier in the third person. I really admire writers who write multiple first person perspectives, because I think that deeply, deeply difficult to distinguish the I voice multiple times. And I'm not sure it's something that I'm brave enough to attempt at this point in my career. And I think the Bone season with only having Paige does work as well, because it is just set in our world. It is an alternate version of our world, but you're in countries that you recognize. You're hearing about Paige being in France or kind of England. There's landmarks that exist in our world. So I think it's a bit easier to filter that just through one person. Whereas the Priory of the Orange Tree is although it is inspired by our world, the countries are their own places with their own history. So in a way, I need multiple voices to introduce the reader to that much of a big new secondary world. Yeah,
that makes absolute sense. But the problem about that, of course, is finding a way of entwining them together. Thinking back to the Tolkien example, the Amazon series Rings of Power has that problem. It's got so many disparate storylines that finding how they connect.
Yeah, I'll be interested to see how they deal with that in season 2, actually. So in fact, in A Day of Fallen Night, which is the prequel to Priory, there was a scene where I really wanted all 4 of the main perspective characters to come together, and I just could not get one of them there. It just would not make sense for her to be on a glacier, like miles away from where she's supposed to be. So I kind of imagined her being there in spirit, like has like a mental connection to one of the characters who are there. But I managed to entwine, 3 of the storylines at that point. Priory the Orange Tree, I do actually manage to get all 4 of them in one place, which I was very proud of. But it does take quite a lot of work and fiddling. And there was another scene in A Day of Fallen Night where there's a character called Wolf, and I really, really needed him to be on a battlefield at a particular time. But he was so far away from this battlefield, and I could not work out how to get him there. So originally there was this slightly unhinged scene where he has to ride a dragon to get there, but people do not ride the fire-breathing dragons in the world of Priory. So I had to kind of debate with my editor, and then I had to change the timeline so that he could get there. He had more time to get there, and it was just I managed it in the end, but it was a bit of a balancing act.
But fun. That sounds like fun. Very much so. So going back to Tolkien, he talked about him seeing his work as applicable to our world, but not allegorical. Because people at that time, back in the 50s, were trying to make the ring to be a nuclear weapon, that kind of simple. Yeah. And that annoyed him like no end. But he was very happy with the idea that you as a reader could apply it to what happens when some very large, powerful weapon is invented. I wondered about the Bone season, because when you come back to work 10 years later, you are coming back really as a reader, primarily, aren't you? Did you see things that you felt were applicable in it to our present moment? Some thematic things.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think I broadly agree with Tolkien's view on allegory. Like I actually went through his letters again quite recently to look at examples of where he spoke about allegory, and pretty much everything he was saying I agreed with. So there's a moment where he talks about the darkness of the present days has had some effect on it, though it is not an allegory. I have already had one letter from America asking for an authoritative exposition on the allegory of the Hobbit. And I think that the idea of like an authoritative exhibition, I think it's a reductive idea that there is one single true meaning behind the text, that all readers should be scrabbling to uncover what the meaning is. And I agree with Tolkien that I don't think that's particularly helpful or a great way to look at fiction, or indeed a great way to write fiction. I think that if you have a very obvious allegory, I think it can feel very didactic, and it feels like there's no room for the reader to bring their own interpretation or the applicability, like you might say. And the thing I love about writing fiction is that every single reader will view it through the lens of their own experiences. And I can't possibly know what those experiences are when I write the text. And it has been fascinating speaking to readers of the Bone season. I haven't heard many comments about the allegory. I did have someone ask me once if it was supposed to represent the queer experience. I think the idea was because all the voyants have different aura colors, so they kind of form a rainbow altogether. So was it supposed to be an allegory for the persecution of queer people throughout history? And I wouldn't want to say, did I write it with that intention? No, but that doesn't mean that your view on it is incorrect. That is your interpretation of it. And I don't want my interpretation of it to be so obvious that it forces out the intent for other interpretations. So yeah, I very much agree that applicability is important. As another thing I wrote down that Tolkien said, he said, there is a moral, I suppose, in any tale worth telling, but that is not the same thing. And he's referring to allegory there. And I agree that often, I mean, you almost can't write fiction without your own morals and opinions being used into it in some way. So yes, the Bone season has a lot of ideas that I agree with, like, you should not mistreat people based on something that they can't control. That's a very fundamental belief I have. But, I wouldn't want to specify it to a particular historical event or a particular situation in the real world, because ultimately it is supposed to be a story, and it's something that is enjoyable, and it's not supposed to be an exact mirroring of our world. But certainly if you have a story that can be applied to the real world, sure, that's great. I don't have any issue with that. I think that is often the mark of a strong character, that, you know, if it allows a lot of people to connect with it and see their own lives and experiences reflected in it, then that's great.
So what's next? You've mentioned that you have just finished the 5th book, which presumably is now going to go into the edit process, or is it already in the edit process?
It's in the edit process. So I've got a couple more proofreads on it, I think, but it's taken shape as the final book.
And are you finding different themes and challenges for Paige evolving during I don't want to ask you too much so you give away what's going on, but just as she's obviously getting older and her position in the power structure is getting more, she's rising in a certain way, as well as being knocked back. You know, there's a sort of, are you thinking that you are touching on other themes which aren't apparent from the Bone season?
Yeah, I always remember I read a review of the Bone season when it first came out, and somebody said something along the lines of, I don't see where she can take the story from here. It feels finished. For me, I was like, no, very much. This is so much bigger than people realized. And I think that, you know, the first book doesn't necessarily let on how much bigger it's going to get. But in this one, Paige is actually taken very much out of her comfort zone, because this is the first time that we leave the Republic of Scion, which is something I always wanted to do, was to show different parts within Scion, but also take Paige outside it. So she's now in the free world for the first time since she was 8 years old. And that was really interesting, because she has learned to survive in Scion, but really doesn't know how to survive outside it at this point. And she has this curious sensation where she thinks of her comfort level in relation to how much closer she's getting to Scion, which is this dystopian, you know, tyrannical state. But she feels completely out of her depth outside it. So that's been, without any spoilers, it's been a really interesting situation for me to explore with Paige. And yeah, a lot of fun, given that she has been steadily creeping up the ladder, and now she's essentially doesn't really know what to do with herself. But yeah, it's kind of the book where, for me, the 4th and the 5th book are where Paige is at her low point, and then she starts going back up again.
Because you are considerably younger, that idea of the oddness of being outside a structure like that reminds me of what I was when I was growing up. It was all about the Iron Curtain. And if you met people who'd come from Eastern Europe, that their idea of what was normal and what was level and comfort was entirely different from, again, free world, but in our political terms rather than in your literary terms. So I'd be very interested to read that and see, because that was a lot of people I was meeting in the early 90s. That was their experience. I was just living in Poland as a British diplomat. And the changes society was going under that time are absolutely fascinating. Things that I had taken as obvious, like you have charities, wasn't normal there, because everything is provided by the state.
Oh, yeah, that's so interesting.
So things like the Samaritans and all that kind of stuff, helplines, was a new concept. And you just have to stop and think, okay, I'm taking so much for granted about my point of view. And this person has had an entirely different set of options.
Exactly.
It's fascinating. So, Samantha, that's been absolutely fascinating. So just as we come out of this discussion, it'd be great if you had a fantasy tip to our listeners, something that you think they might enjoy reading or watching, or even a tip about writing that you value as something that really helps you.
You know, in terms of writing advice, I'm actually so terrible at this. And I think I put my finger on why recently. And I think it's because I'm totally self-taught. So I feel like I wasn't taught how to write, and therefore how to express how to write to other people, which is something I'm trying to wrestle with recently. In terms of a general tip, mine actually relates to music. So something that really inspires me is listening to instrumental music, particularly film scores. And often film scores, they've been obviously made to express a particular emotion or a particular pace. And I find that so helpful when I'm writing fiction. So many of my playlists are just like the scores of action films, or, anything that is a film that reminds me of the book I'm trying to write, or a scene that I'm trying to write. Putting the score on in the background, I find really helpful. It's very different from music with lyrics, because for me, music with lyrics, I struggle to write to that because the lyrics give it a story. So that clashes with my story. But instrumental music allows you to capture the atmosphere or the pace or anything else, but apply your own story to it. So that would be my main writing tip.
Brilliant. Thank you. I totally agree with you there. I sometimes make playlists for characters with music with lyrics, but I'm not listening to that while writing that character. It's just more like an aid memoir as to what kind of person they are.
Oh, absolutely. Same. Yeah.
So we always finish by asking where in all the fantasy worlds is the best place for something. And in honor of the bone season, I thought we would talk about where is the best place to have an extrasensory perception gift. And just before we started recording, you were saying, I don't think there's anywhere good to go with that. So have you come up with somewhere where actually you'd be safe and happy or interesting to have a gift like that?
To really rack my brains, I feel like there must be a few books I've read where it's a good idea to have magic. But I think often in fiction, it's either that, magic users are very revered, but I feel like they're rarer than books where magic is feared and where magic users are persecuted in some way. I could think of a few where you maybe could find a place if you had an extrasensory gift. So there's Her Majesty's Royal Coven by Juno Dawson, which kind of has a government department of witches, which is internally deeply flawed in various ways. But you, I suppose, could technically use, if you could get into the right administration. Yeah. I just finished a book which is coming out in 2025 called The Notorious Virtues by Orwin Hamilton. And that one's really interesting because it has one family of magic users who have hoarded all of the magic and the wealth in this community. So I suppose if you were a member of that family, you'd be okay. Yeah, and other magic users do exist. It's just that they've kind of taken the lion's share of it. But the way that magic is used in that book is really interesting. I would definitely recommend it when it comes out. And then similarly, there's another book which is coming out in October called Until We Shatter by Kate Dillon. And again, there's some areas in which magic users are persecuted, but there's this city where people can use magic that corresponds to different colors. And there's something called the Council of Shades, which kind of, they revere magic as long as you're not a certain kind of magic user. There always seems to be kind of caveats when magic is accepted in fantasy. But yeah, I suppose there's probably a very obvious example that I'm missing, but those are the only three that I could think of off the top of my head. You don't want to have it in the bone season, basically.
Yeah, it's problematic. Though being without it is also problematic, isn't it?
Very much so. Yeah, as long as you find your little niche in the bone season world, in the criminal underworld, you can have a good time with it, but you have to stay out of the way of the forces of power.
So my pick for this is I actually wrote a whole series as under my pen name Joss Sterling, the Savant series, which is a YA series starting in about, when did I start that? About 2009, I think. And the first one of that is called Finding Sky. It's contemporary setting, and a lot of people who know me as a writer, that's the series they love because the Savants are like a secret society working within our contemporary world. Okay. And it has an element of fated love in it as well. So it's a good world to have ESP. But okay, somebody else's world, I think I would pick, well, there's lots of good places to be a witch, isn't there? If we think being a witch, having those kind of gifts is similar. Yeah. I wouldn't mind being James Nichols, who's one of our tutors, one of our courses. He wrote a series called The Apprentice Witch. Cool. A kind of cozy fantasy for middle grade. That's quite a nice place to have these gifts.
Yes,
not too dangerous. You're not going to be, come to a sticky end in the way of the bone season.
I imagine cozy fantasy. It's not something I read a lot of, but I imagine there is a wealth of nice places to have magic within that genre.
I'm not surprised to hear that. Thank you so much, Samantha, and we look forward to the 5th installment in due course. But in the meantime, do look up the wonderful 10th anniversary edition. If you read The Bone Season a while ago, it's well worth going back to now because you'll get, as we've just heard, so much more from it and a sort of finely polished version after the 10 years on. edit job that was done. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to Mythmakers podcast, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. Visit oxfordcenterforfantasy.org to join in the fun. Find out about our online courses, in-person stays in Oxford, plus visit our shop for great gifts. Tell a friend and subscribe wherever you find your favourite podcasts worldwide.